The cars surrounded the terrorists' vehicle. Ashy. Immediately, the special forces soldiers got out, aiming their rifles and pulling the triggers.
That was just one of the Israeli raids against irresponsible Islamic leaders responsible for terrorist attacks. It was part of an unending struggle, both on the Gaza border and in the West Bank. Squads from different Israeli special forces took part in the response to Hamas's terrorist acts on October 7, 2023, and attacks by other organizations were fundamental in different missions, some of them worthy of movie scenes.
The creation of the State of Israel was a troubled process in which war played a central role, from the moment it declared itself a nation until today. It's not that the territory doesn't have its own history of wars. Imash. After all, wherever humans set foot, blood inevitably feeds the earth and eyes are flooded with tears. The Hebrews were dominated by the Assyrians and Babylonians, and then saw these two peoples fall to the Persians. Alexander the Great overthrew the Persian Empire in the 4th century before Christ, and his conquest left the region of Palestine under the control of his successors, Ishtu. Then came the Romans in the 1st century before Christ, and then the Byzantines, who were replaced by the Islamic caliphates, which rose and fell in the sands of the desert. After the 7th century AD, Christian crusaders caused their turmoil for about 100 years, around the 13th century AD, but with violent visits from the Mongols and then domination by the Muslims again. The Turks dominated the region in the 16th century, having several disputes, including with Egypt, until their fall in World War I. The British took care of all the chaos until they realized the problem they had gotten themselves into and left the place so that the problems could proliferate on their own amid so much conflict and opposition. Leaving the war at its core was necessary to understand how so many strategies, generals, and armies rose and fell in those lands. The Israelis have fought wars against multiple armed groups, facing the surrounding states or engaging in unconventional battles, mainly with the Palestinians. That's why their special forces became so important. It can be said that these commando groups, which today carry out reconnaissance missions or counter-terrorism activities, originated decades earlier, when Ariel Sharon, Nektach, who would one day become Prime Minister of Israel, fought in the so-called Battle for Jerusalem. Sharon was listed in the Haganah Ta'engshach, the Zionist paramilitary organization that operated alongside the British at the time. Sharon's unit entered into intense and continuous combat starting in the fall of 1947, when the Battle for Jerusalem began. With few resources to maintain control of the roads, Sharon's team adopted quick and evasive attack tactics against the Arab forces near Kfar Malal. In groups of 30, soldiers carried out frequent raids on Arab villages, bridges, and strategic posts, as well as ambushing traffic between villages and enemy bases. In 1953, Sharon founded and commanded Unit 101. In the Israeli armed forces, they already had maneuver tactics using small units and special infiltration and exfiltration techniques. Only those who were invited could be part of Unit 101. The following year, they were merged with Paratrooper Battalion 890, so that their experience could be passed on to the armed forces. From then on, special forces and intelligence agencies became essential for survival, the Israeli presidency being involved in important as well as controversial operations. Mossad was without a doubt the most well-known intelligence service. Founded in 1949, it emerged as an integral part of the state it was supposed to protect. Its motto was taken from the book of Proverbs, where there is no guidance, the people fall, but in a multitude of counselors there is safety. But there are more stories to be told, like that of Military Intelligence Directorate, the organization responsible for military intelligence, and XPT Internal Security Service. Just like so many other units, some of the special units were among the first to respond to the terrorist attack on October 7th. The fight against Hamas, in those days and afterwards, would involve important special operations as well as constant intelligence gathering by the intelligence agencies. The terrorist attack on October 7th was a milestone in history, a moment when Israel experienced one of the worst massacres against its civilians. Hundreds of people were killed, dozens were kidnapped in an invasion that caught many unprepared soldiers and swept through with a wave of violence. Civilians in their homes and children who saw their parents killed right in front of them. Physical and moral barriers were broken. On that day, special Hamas troops, like the Nukba force, invaded by sea, entering Israeli coastal bases. Thousands crossed the Israeli border to put Operation Al-Aqsa Flood into action. Hamas entered Israel Defense Forces posts, the Israel Defense Forces taking the locations by surprise. It was a violent day, which only foreshadowed months of more violence ahead. Drones were launched by Hamas in attacks like they had never done before. Those Hamas men who entered had the intention of terror, death, and kidnapping without any doubt. Their own footage showed how they found civilians having their breakfast and shot without a second thought. These men ran through these houses to kill and kidnap. At the festival that was attacked, more than 250 people were killed. Mass kidnappings happened, and the entry into military bases was brutal. Not only did Hamas release their videos from this phase, the Al-Quds brigades, the armed wing of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad organization, took part in the attacks. Less well known, this was the second largest fighting group in the Gaza Strip after Hamas, and it would become one of the key players in the fight against Israel. The terror advanced into these posts, taking the soldiers by surprise. The few who tried to resist felt the fire of the AKs take the breath of life from them. Others were taken as prisoners of war. Everything was coordinated and observed, part of long years of preparation. Many kept entering these places, but the Israeli Defense Forces recovered from the violent surprise, striking terror with fire. Anyone who still tried to reach by sea was brutally intercepted. Special forces were deployed to retake several posts. Among them was Shatet 13 or Flotilla 13, the Israeli Navy's reconnaissance unit. They weren't in that fight for nothing. The volunteers of Shatet 13 had to agree to serve for at least 4.5 years and undergo 20 months of training. Therefore, many of those men fighting to retake the bases from Hamas had been used to missions for some time. Their motto would be present several times during that war. As the bat emerges from the darkness, as the blade cuts through the silence, as the grenade crushes with rage, there would be nighttime attacks cutting through Hamas's defenses and blowing up their men. But while they weren't launching their counterattack in Gaza, the special forces had to remove the enemy from inside Israel. Unit 5101 or Chodak, part of the Israeli Air Force, came to help, surprising Hamas in many areas, especially in Beirut, where 101 civilians were killed and 32 were kidnapped. These soldiers specialized in covert operations, combat search and rescue, and hostage rescue. Nash. After 22 months of training, they were required to sign 2-year contracts. That Nash. The name of the unit meant Kingfisher, a reference to the phrase of the founder of the British Special Air Service and pioneer of Special Forces, David Sterling, who said that his unit would strike an enemy. Just like a kingfisher attacks its prey, the symbol of Shaldag would be the kingfisher and its motto, rare species, strange bird. Irregular special forces operated to eliminate the presence of Hamas inside Israel within a few days after the start of the terrorist attack on October 7th. But after Hamas was expelled, other issues arose. How did such a major security failure happen? Where was the intelligence services screening? The danger has always existed. Recently, the Israelis fought on the edges of Gaza in 2014, 2021, and 2022. There were many factors that led Shin Bet to Amman and caused Mossad to fail terribly. Until October 7th, Israel was concerned about Iran and its actions in neighboring states, fueling groups more powerful than Hamas, such as Hezbollah. Israel's concerns included covert actions, as well as cyber attacks and military operations in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and reportedly even in Yemen. Israel's intelligence and military resources were overstretched, requiring prioritization in the face of a variety of enemies. There was negligence and arrogance toward Hamas, seen as a lesser enemy, just a small terrorist group, but not everyone thought that way. Security officials warned that Netanyahu's tensions with the White House would give Israel's enemies the incentive to act. Two agencies were very important in Gaza, Shin Bet and Amman. Shin Bet was mainly responsible for gathering human intelligence, that is, using traditional spies and other types of monitoring through human sources. Its three departments were the security of high-profile individuals, the control of extremists and espionage within Israel, and finally, the Arab Surveillance Department in Gaza. Shin Bet had difficulties infiltrating parts of Hamas's structure as collaborators were discovered and killed. A year prior to October 7th, their agents even managed to obtain a document called the Jericho Wall File, which described a plan to invade Israel, and it resembled events of October 7th. In addition to the training needed to carry out this operation, to the despair of Shin Bet, this information was ignored and never reached high-ranking officials. Furthermore, there was negligence when some of the human relations were replaced by signal interception. Amman was responsible for signal intelligence in Gaza, that is, intercepting communication signal, like phone messages, radio transmissions, digital network data, and satellite communications. The signals also indicated Hamas training sessions. A soldier took this information to her superiors, but they said those supposed Hamas plans were absurd, and they would never be able to defeat the Israel Defense Forces if they tried that. Once again, the warning did not reach the highest levels of the hierarchy. Arrogance, bureaucracy, and the focus on Iran and Hezbollah were blinding the Israel Defense Forces. A system was supposed to prevent this. Amman has what's called the Devil's Advocate or Red Team. This group has the duty to systematically challenge the prevailing assessment at the time, to make people see things differently and not get lost only in what seems most likely and obvious. The forewarnings from the Red Team were ignored. The mistakes were recorded, discussed, and now it was time to strike back. Shin Bet would be a particularly active group on this occasion, and one of the battlefronts that was less talked about than Gaza, but no less important, was the West Bank, where special forces would try to prevent attacks and stop Islamic leaders from planning events like October 7. The Israelis were not facing problems with Hamas and other radical Palestinian groups only in the Gaza Strip. Less well known, but also very important, was the region of the West Bank, or Cisjordania, so called because it is to the west of the Jordan River. It has always been a region of a lot of conflict. There are many factors that make the place important, but one that stands out to make people really remember the West Bank is to point out that the eastern part of Jerusalem is there. Hamas was well known for fighting in Gaza, but it had its presence in the West Bank, even though it wasn't as strong. There were still other groups active, like the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Lions Den, the Jenin Brigades, and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades. For more than a year, the West Bank has faced a sharp escalation of violence. Between October 2022 and September 2023, incidents of political unrest increased by 50% compared to the previous year. This increase was driven by a combination of intensified aggression by Israeli settlers, expanded Israel Defense Forces operations, and, significantly, the resurgence of Palestinian armed factions. After more than 15 years of relative inactivity, the inactivity occurred in part after the Oslo Peace Treaty. But speaking of radicals, although that's not the topic here, it's essential to remember that the violence did not come only from Palestinians. Extremist Israeli settlers attacked repeatedly, to the point that the Israeli group Hilltop Youth was designated by the United States Department of the Treasury and faced sanctions. But, returning to the topic, clashes between Palestinian armed groups and Israeli security forces increased even more. Although there are groups like the Israeli Border Police, there was at least one key unit in these confrontations. Yaman, the National Counter-Terrorism Unit, Widash. The motto of these operators was, "I will pursue my enemies, I will overtake them, and I will not return until they are destroyed." In fact, they pursued several of them in the West Bank, many of these terrorists on their way to attack or leaders of radical squads. Those men fighting against terrorist activities were recruited only from veterans of the Israel Defense Forces combat units or the Israeli Border Police who had completed their mandatory military service. In addition, the soldier must have already served in one of the special forces and completed a 7-month training. They left the armored vehicles for night combat, prepared to face ambushes in the city of Nablus. In fact, the Aqsa Martyrs brigades and the men of the Lions Den were prepared to face them. Shots from these enemies came from everywhere when the fighting started, but Yaman had a specific target that day, the Lions Den bomb lab. Without distractions, they headed to the position, moving through the alleys of Nablus. The explosions came right after, when the killer fired toward the target, literally clearing the way. The equipment was designed to blow up doors and walls, creating openings in double brick walls. The Lion's Den was targeted by Israeli special operations several times. In one of them, a bomb was planted on one of the small streets of Nablus, where Tamer Kailani, the leader of the organization, routinely passed by. The explosion killed him instantly. His death made the Palestinians nervous, and the Israelis did not claim responsibility for the act. The operations of the border police and the Yemen continued, targeting many from the lion's den. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad was a challenge for Yemen. The group demonstrated its power and its preparation of rockets for attacks on Israel. They operated in both Gaza and the West Bank. Their rockets were launched from civilian areas, densely populated locations. Many of them came back repeatedly and hit the regions from where they were launched, even killing civilians, including children. Neutralizing these cells and their leaders was necessary. This type of mission was common for Yemen, always surrounded by enemies. Running through Nablus or Jenin during the day was an even greater risk of becoming targets. They needed to be quick to try to reach safe positions where they could use the killers or grenade launchers to destroy the bases where the enemies were entrenched. The rifle shots from one of these bases before the recent war went through the body of the senior Islamic Jihad commander, Farouk Salami. Not all Palestinian fighters died that way. The drones were providing support, detecting their movements and dropping bombs, which ended the resistance on Yemen's path. The defense of these Palestinian groups was not random. Often, they were trained by shooting at Israeli forces during the night, which made good training and intelligence extremely necessary reinforcements in addition to drone technology. Some ambushes put the Israeli soldiers in the position of having to evacuate the wounded and dead during the shootouts. The strategies of the Islamic armed movements were often deadly, blowing up Israeli vehicles with improvised bombs, leaving the bodies of men and women from the border police lying on the ground in the West Bank. Technology was needed to survive these ambushes. The drones spotted many of the Palestinian soldiers on the corners, analyzing their movements. The information was relayed to the ground to maintain order. When necessary, the order came to eliminate the resistance. This analysis needed to be careful to avoid disasters, like on the day when teenagers dressed in black, like so many Palestinian jihad fighters, they threw small bombs at the Israelis and ended up being shot in Jenin. Accurate information was what Shin Bet was looking for, like to find Yas Hanam, who had already attacked the kibbutz on the border. The drone attack put an end to this kind of activity by the member of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The three accused of terrorist attacks met the same fate when they were found by Shin Bet. Two senior members of Hamas, Ahmed Abu Ara and Hafat Dawazi, had killed an Israeli in a terrorist attack. Their fate was sealed shortly afterwards. The Shin Bet and the Yaman carried out many joint operations, such as the one that tracked the movements of Wiyassan Hazen, the head of the Hamas terrorist network, in Jenin. His path was blocked by the Israel Defense Forces armored vehicle, which fired at the Palestinian leader's car, ending the life of one of the occupants. The shots went through the windshield and made the two surviving men jump out of the vehicle, returning fire. They ran using the car that blocked Yemen's advance as cover. Too bad for them that their car didn't block the drone's path, which fired at one of them as he tried to escape. The second one stopped for just a moment, feeling safe and panting with exhaustion. The fire came shortly after. The fighting and gunfire were intense for Yemen. His soldiers risked themselves in various parts of the West Bank, including in Tokar, where they encountered the local Hamas leader, Ashraf Naf. He was responsible for producing and planting explosives against the Israel Defense Forces, as well as recruiting agents for Hamas. During a shootout with Israeli forces, Ashraf was detected by drones. He was reloading to re-engage with the enemy troops when the drone hit him. Spies found the Hamas command center in Jenin, and soon the place was blown up, keeping up the pressure. This happened in such a way that an entire squad of fighters was found and killed by drone strikes, and the Israel Defense Forces siege in Nablus. Abdullah Abu Shala, leader of a terrorist cell, received funds from Iran and carried out a series of attacks in Jerusalem. A year before his car was blown up, Oshimbet set Yamaha on the trail of armed militants from the Al-Aqsa martyrs. The drones had been following the men since the spies reported their presence. They got into the car without knowing they were being watched. The orders over the radio set the Yamaha in motion to intercept the enemy vehicle. The operators got out of the cars, riddling the target vehicle with bullets. The shots pierced through the doors and windows with impunity, passing through the bodies and seats of the vehicle. The end of the job was confirmed with the doors left open. Total. As quickly as they appeared, the Israelis took the escape route, followed by the drone, until they met up with an armored escort. These missions were just part of what the Israeli special forces did together. Many were surgical strikes against their enemies in Gaza and the West Bank, but it always seemed like they were fighting a hydra. With every head they struck, another would appear, worse, as if the propaganda from extremist groups, terrorist acts by Hamas and other organizations, and external funding weren't enough. The long history of conflict only added more fuel to the fire in the region. When disasters happen, with bombings that killed entire families or Israeli settlers shooting at Palestinian farmers, the cycle fed itself by planting seeds of hatred